The Corinthian Empire had been the undisputed ruler of the galaxy for 10,000 years. Their massive fleets patrolled every corner of known space, their laws governed trillions of beings across countless worlds, and their technology was the envy of every other civilization. But here's the thing that nobody talked about openly: the Corinthians didn't actually understand most of their own technology. They had inherited it, not invented it. Long ago, before the Corinthians even learned to fly, there was another civilization called the Precursors. Nobody knew much about them except that they had been incredibly advanced and then suddenly disappeared without a trace. They left behind artifacts, machines, and structures scattered across the galaxy like abandoned toys in a playground. The Corinthians had built their entire empire by finding these ancient devices and figuring out how to turn them on. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes entire research teams vanished when they pushed the wrong button. Deep inside the Imperial Palace on Krynth Prime, the capital world of the Empire, there was a place that gave even the Emperor nightmares. They called it the Vault of Ancestors. It was a chamber so vast that you could fit a small city inside it, and its walls were lined with hundreds of precursor artifacts. Some glowed with strange light. Others hummed with energy that made your teeth ache. A few just sat there, silent and ominous, as if they were waiting for something. The most terrifying object in the entire vault was simply called the Titan. It stood 300 meters tall, roughly the height of a 100-story building. Its surface wasn't made of any metal that current science could identify. Instead, it seemed to flow like liquid but remained solid to the touch. The Titan's shape was humanoid but wrong in subtle ways that hurt to look at for too long. Its geometry didn't quite make sense, as if parts of it existed in dimensions that human eyes couldn't fully perceive. For thousands of years, the Empire's greatest scientists had studied the Titan. They had scanned it with every instrument they possessed. They had analyzed samples that took centuries to extract. They had built entire universities dedicated to understanding just this one artifact. But despite all their efforts, they had learned almost nothing useful. The only thing they knew for certain was that the Titan was incredibly dangerous. Ancient precursor records, translated with great difficulty, contained warnings about activation protocols. One partially decoded text suggested that turning on a Titan could either save a civilization or destroy it. The Corinthians had decided long ago that the risk was too great. The Titan would remain dormant, a monument to mysteries better left unsolved. That's when Jake Martinez showed up. Jake was nobody special by galactic standards. He was just a 28-year-old mechanic from one of Earth's outer colonies, a dusty mining settlement where things broke constantly and you learned to fix them or you didn't survive. Humanity had only been traveling between stars for about 90 years, which made them practically infants compared to races like the Corinthians who had been spacefaring for tens of thousands of years. Jake had signed up with a maintenance contractor that worked on alien installations because the pay was decent and he was curious about how other civilizations built things. His crew had been hired to repair some environmental control systems in the Imperial Palace. It was supposed to be a simple job, the kind of thing his team did all the time. Replace some worn-out components, recalibrate some sensors, maybe update some software, and then head home with a nice paycheck. The thing about Jake was that he had this gift for understanding how machines worked. He didn't have fancy degrees or years of formal training. He just looked at a system and somehow knew what it was supposed to do. His buddies back home used to joke that Jake could fix a broken engine just by staring at it hard enough. It wasn't magic, just an intuitive sense for patterns and connections that most people didn't have. The Corinthians who supervised the maintenance work treated Jake and his human crew like useful idiots. They were polite enough on the surface, but you could see the condescension in their three eyes. To them, humans were these hyperactive children who had barely learned to walk and were now stumbling around the galaxy touching everything. They were useful for grunt work like maintenance but not sophisticated enough to understand truly advanced technology. Jake didn't mind the attitude much. He'd dealt with prejudice before, and besides, he was too busy being fascinated by Corinthian engineering. Their systems were elegant but weirdly inefficient, as if they had been designed by committee over thousands of years with nobody willing to start fresh. He kept finding workarounds and improvements that the Corinthians had never considered. One day, while tracing a faulty power conduit through the palace's lower levels, Jake's handheld scanner started picking up something strange. There was an energy signature coming from somewhere it shouldn't be, a low-frequency pulse that didn't match anything in the palace's official system blueprints. His supervisor told him to ignore it and stay on task, but Jake had never been good at ignoring mysteries. The moment Jake's hand made contact with that glowing interface, everything went wrong. Or maybe it went exactly right, depending on how you looked at it. Either way, all hell broke loose. The Titan's eyes opened first. They weren't really eyes in the traditional sense, more like massive apertures that suddenly blazed with light so bright that Jake had to shield his face. The light was blue-white and pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Then the sound started. It was a deep thrumming that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. The entire vault began to vibrate, and dust that had settled over millennia started falling from the ceiling like snow. Energy exploded outward from the Titan in waves. Ancient systems that had been dormant since before the Corinthian Empire even existed suddenly roared to life. Conduits hidden in the walls began glowing. Machines that no living being had ever seen operate started moving and humming. The energy surge didn't stop at the vault either. It rippled through the entire palace like a shockwave, and the Corinthian technology couldn't handle it. Power grids that had run smoothly for centuries overloaded in seconds. Lights exploded throughout the palace. Computer systems crashed or started displaying gibberish. Communication networks went haywire, broadcasting static on every frequency. In the city outside the palace, the chaos spread even further. Transportation systems froze mid-flight. Buildings lost power. Emergency alarms screamed from every direction. It was as if someone had plugged a lightning bolt directly into a child's toy, and now everything was melting. Emperor Malthor was in a council meeting when the palace lights died and emergency systems kicked in with their harsh red glow. His advisors started shouting over each other, trying to figure out what was happening. When word reached him that a human maintenance worker had activated the Titan, the Emperor's reaction was immediate and predictable. He wanted Jake Martinez dead, immediately, no trial necessary. Security forces rushed toward the vault with weapons charged and kill orders transmitted. But they couldn't get close. The Titan had erected some kind of defensive barrier around itself and Jake. Energy shields shimmered in the air, and any guard who tried to push through got thrown backward like they'd touched an electric fence. The Emperor's best soldiers, warriors who had trained for decades, couldn't get within 50 meters of the awakening construct. Meanwhile, Jake was experiencing something that no human, and possibly no living being in the current galaxy, had ever experienced before. When he touched that interface, something had connected directly to his brain. Not painfully, but it was overwhelming in a way that's hard to describe. Imagine suddenly being able to hear 1,000 radio stations at once, but instead of music, it's pure information pouring directly into your mind. He could sense the Titan's presence now, like a massive consciousness waking up from a very long sleep. It wasn't hostile. That was the first thing Jake understood through the connection. The Titan wasn't a weapon preparing to destroy everything, despite what the panicking Corinthians believed. It was more like a computer booting up, running through diagnostic checks and trying to figure out where it was and what it was supposed to do. Through the neural link, Jake started receiving impressions, almost like memories but not quite. He saw flashes of the precursors, the ancient civilization that had built the Titan. They hadn't looked anything like he expected. In fact, they looked remarkably human in some ways. Bipedal, 2 arms, similar height. It was strange and a little unsettling. Then Jake started understanding something that would change everything. The precursor technology hadn't been designed with the Corinthians in mind at all. For 10,000 years, the Empire had been trying to use tools that were fundamentally incompatible with how their minds worked. The Corinthians processed information differently. They thought in rigid hierarchies and mathematical formulas. Their brains were wired for precision and order. Humans were different. Human brains were messy, chaotic things that made intuitive leaps and saw patterns that shouldn't exist. Humans had this weird ability to look at something they'd never seen before and just guess how it might work, and often they'd be right even if they couldn't explain why. It was the same instinct that had let ancient humans look at a round stone and imagine a wheel, or see a vine and imagine a rope. The precursors had apparently thought the same way. Their control systems weren't based on precise mathematical commands. They were based on intent and intuition. You didn't program them in the traditional sense. You thought at them, showed them what you wanted, and they interpreted your intentions. For a species like the Corinthians, who needed clear protocols and explicit instructions, these systems might as well have been magic. But for someone like Jake, who'd spent his whole life feeling out how machines worked rather than calculating it, the precursor interface felt almost natural. As the connection deepened, Jake started hearing something like whispers in his mind. Not words exactly, but concepts and purposes being communicated directly. The Titan was trying to tell him what it was, what it had been built to do. The impressions came faster now. Images of worlds being transformed, atmospheres being cleaned, continents being reshaped. The Titan wasn't a weapon at all. It was a tool for building and healing on a planetary scale. The Corinthians had spent millennia afraid of their most valuable asset because they'd never understood its basic nature. They'd been like children who found a fire hose and assumed it must be a weapon because it was powerful, never realizing it was meant to save things, not destroy them. Jake tried to move, to step back from the interface, but he couldn't. He was locked in place, not by force but by necessity. The awakening sequence needed a conscious mind to guide it, to confirm that activation was intentional. Breaking contact now might cause a catastrophic failure. He was stuck, connected to a god machine while an Empire's security forces tried to figure out how to kill him before he supposedly destroyed everything. Outside the barrier, the Emperor's technicians were frantically trying to shut down the Titan remotely. Every attempt failed. The Titan's systems ignored their commands completely, responding only to the neural patterns of the human who had activated it. 10,000 years of Corinthian research had just been rendered obsolete by a 28-year-old mechanic who'd pushed the right button. The information flowing into Jake's mind was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't like reading a book or watching a video. It was more like remembering things he'd somehow always known, except these were memories from a civilization that died millions of years before his ancestors learned to make fire. The Titan was transferring entire libraries worth of data directly into his brain, and somehow, impossibly, he could understand it. The first thing Jake learned was that the precursors weren't the godlike beings that most civilizations imagined them to be. They hadn't been all-powerful rulers who conquered the galaxy through force. They'd been engineers. Really, really good engineers, sure, but fundamentally they'd been problem solvers who happened to work on a galactic scale. They'd looked at the universe and seen it the same way Jake looked at a broken engine, as something that could be understood, improved, and fixed. The precursors had spent millions of years spreading across the galaxy, building and creating. But they'd also been paying attention to patterns. They noticed that civilizations rose and fell in cycles. Species would develop technology, reach for the stars, build great empires, and then something would go wrong. Sometimes it was war. Sometimes it was environmental collapse. Sometimes it was a random cosmic disaster like a gamma-ray burst or a rogue black hole. The universe, they realized, was beautiful but also terribly dangerous for organic life. So the precursors had started a project that would take thousands of generations to complete. They built the Titans and scattered them across the galaxy, hiding them on worlds where younger civilizations would eventually find them. These weren't weapons or monuments to precursor greatness. They were tools, left behind like a parent leaves instructions for their children. Insurance policies against catastrophe. The Titans were designed to activate when species reached a certain level of development. Not too early, when they'd lacked the technology to even find them, but not too late either, when they might have grown rigid and fearful of the unknown. The sweet spot was right when a civilization was young enough to still be curious, brave enough to experiment, and smart enough to not immediately destroy themselves with power they didn't understand. Through the neural link, the Titan began showing Jake visions of what it had been built to do. He saw dying worlds brought back to life. Planets where the atmosphere had been poisoned were cleaned in a matter of weeks. Worlds torn apart by geological instability were stabilized. He saw a star that was about to go supernova prematurely, which would have wiped out 3 inhabited systems. A Titan had somehow adjusted the star's internal processes, buying the local civilizations thousands of years to evacuate or solve the problem. The visions were incredible and humbling. The Titans could reshape continents, redirect asteroid fields, even manipulate weather patterns on a planetary scale. They were terraformers, constructors, and guardians all rolled into one. They represented the precursor's final gift to the galaxy, the tools to survive and thrive despite the universe's hostility. But the visions didn't stop at the good stuff. The Titan also showed Jake the darker side of what could happen when ancient technology fell into the wrong hands. He saw civilizations that had found precursor artifacts and tried to weaponize them. He saw empires that hoarded the technology, keeping it secret from others, using their monopoly on advanced devices to maintain power and control. Most of these civilizations eventually collapsed under the weight of their own stagnation. That's when Jake understood what had really happened to the Corinthian Empire. They'd found tons of precursor technology early in their development, which had given them a massive advantage over other species. They'd built their entire civilization on top of these ancient foundations. But instead of trying to truly understand the technology, they'd just learned which buttons to push. Instead of sharing their discoveries with other species, they'd made it illegal for anyone else to even study precursor artifacts. Over thousands of years, the Corinthians had stopped innovating. Why bother inventing new things when you could just find more old things? Their scientists had become archaeologists and their engineers had become maintenance workers. They'd built museums and vaults to store precursor technology instead of laboratories to understand it. They'd grown comfortable, fat, and lazy on inherited wealth they didn't really comprehend. The worst part was that they'd become afraid. Afraid of activating things they didn't understand. Afraid of other species learning their secrets. Afraid of losing the power that came from being the keepers of ancient mysteries. Fear had replaced curiosity, and when a civilization stops being curious, it starts dying even if it doesn't realize it yet. The Titan showed Jake one more crucial piece of information. The precursors had designed their technology to work best with species that thought like they did. Intuitive, creative, willing to experiment and take risks. Species that could look at an unknown system and think, I wonder what this does, instead of we should lock this away and never touch it. Species like humanity. Humans had only been in space for 90 years, barely a heartbeat in galactic terms, but they'd already started finding dormant precursor sites and figuring them out through trial and error. Earth scientists had activated more precursor technology in the last decade than the Corinthians had in the last 1,000 years, mostly because humans weren't afraid to experiment. Sure, there'd been some accidents and explosions, but that was how you learned. The neural link pulsed with what felt like approval. The Titan recognized something in Jake and his species. They were the kind of civilization the precursors had hoped would find these tools. Young, curious, and just reckless enough to actually use them. Not perfectly wise or all-knowing, but willing to learn and adapt. Jake's mind reeled from the implications. The Corinthians had built their empire on precursor technology they barely understood, and now a human had activated the one thing they'd been most afraid of. Not because humans were special or superior, but because they'd approached it the way the precursors intended, with curiosity instead of fear, with hands-on experimentation instead of cautious study. Outside the barrier, he could hear Emperor Malthor screaming orders. The ruler of the galaxy's most powerful empire was panicking, and Jake suddenly understood why. This wasn't just about one Titan activating. The whole galaxy was about to learn that the Corinthians had been sitting on the keys to the kingdom for millennia without ever figuring out how to turn them. When the Titan took its first step, the entire planet felt it. Buildings swayed across the capital city. Windows shattered. Vehicle alarms screamed. Seismographs registered the movement as a magnitude 6 earthquake, except it wasn't natural and it wasn't stopping. The 300-meter construct began walking with surprising grace for something so massive, and each footfall sent tremors rippling through the ground for kilometers in every direction. Emperor Malthor watched through the palace's emergency monitors as the ancient machine emerged from the vault, tearing through walls like they were paper. His face went through several shades of purple, which Jake would later learn was how Corinthians looked when they were absolutely terrified and trying not to show it. The Emperor's voice cracked as he gave the order that he probably knew was useless but felt compelled to give anyway: open fire with everything. The Imperial fleet responded instantly. Warships that had been in orbital patrol dove toward the surface, weapons charging. These weren't small ships either. The Corinthian military had vessels the size of cities, equipped with energy cannons that could slag entire mountains. They'd used these same ships to conquer rebellious systems and enforce the empire's will across the galaxy. The firepower they could bring to bear was enough to sterilize a planet's surface. Energy beams lanced down from orbit, bright enough to blind anyone looking directly at them. Missiles followed, each one carrying enough explosive power to level a city block. The bombardment was so intense that it created a firestorm visible from space. The palace's defensive systems activated automatically, trying to protect the surrounding city, but everyone watching expected to see nothing left where the Titan had been standing. When the smoke cleared, the Titan was completely unharmed. It hadn't even slowed down. The shields surrounding it weren't like anything in the modern galactic arsenal. The energy beams didn't bounce off or get absorbed. They just sort of stopped existing when they hit the barrier, as if the Titan's defenses were simply deleting the attacks from reality. Scientists watching the battle would later realize the shields were manipulating spacetime itself, creating a bubble where the laws of physics worked differently. Jake, still connected to the Titan through the neural link, could feel the shields working. It wasn't like the machine was exerting effort to defend itself. The defenses were just a basic feature, like how your skin keeps out water without you having to think about it. The entire might of the Corinthian military was essentially throwing rocks at a mountain and expecting results. But here's where things got interesting. Through the neural connection, Jake could feel what the Titan wanted to do, and it wasn't anything violent. The machine had zero interest in fighting back or destroying the fleet that was attacking it. That wasn't what it had been built for. Jake realized he could guide the Titan's actions through his thoughts, so he did something that would be talked about in galactic history books for centuries: he made it start fixing things. The Titan raised one massive hand, and energy poured out in waves that were nothing like the weapons firing at it. Everywhere the awakening sequence had caused damage, the destruction began reversing. Power grids that had overloaded suddenly repaired themselves. Buildings that had cracked when the Titan emerged from the vault sealed their fractures. Computer systems that had crashed rebooted with all their data intact. It was like watching a video of destruction played in reverse. But the Titan didn't stop there. It started fixing things that had been broken long before it woke up. There was a section of the capital city that had been damaged in a terrorist attack 20 years ago, rebuilt but never quite the same. The Titan restored it to perfect condition. An ancient monument that had been slowly crumbling for centuries suddenly looked brand new. Even the landscaping got fixed. Parks that had brown patches from drought suddenly had healthy grass again. The Imperial military kept firing for another 10 minutes before someone high up in the command chain finally ordered them to stop. They were wasting ammunition and energy on a target that wasn't fighting back and clearly couldn't be hurt. More importantly, the Titan was making them look stupid. Here they were, bombarding their own capital city, while the thing they were attacking was doing nothing but repairs. Then reports started coming in from across the galaxy that changed everything. Jake felt it through the neural link first. When he'd activated this Titan, he'd woken up the whole network. There were dozens of other Titans on different worlds, and they were all coming online. But they weren't preparing for war or conquest. They were doing exactly what Jake's Titan was doing, fixing things. On a human mining colony struggling with atmospheric processes that kept breaking down, a Titan that had been mistaken for a weird geological formation suddenly activated and repaired the entire life support system in hours. On an alien world where volcanic activity threatened to destroy a major city, another Titan emerged and somehow stabilized the planet's core. There was even a space station that had been slowly losing orbit for years, and a Titan appeared out of nowhere to boost it back into a safe trajectory. Emperor Maltha's military commanders started reporting something that made the Emperor's blood run cold. Human settlements throughout the galaxy were lighting up with precursor activity. Humans who worked with ancient technology, from archaeologists to mechanics to curious amateurs, were suddenly figuring out how to activate systems that had been dormant for millions of years. Earth's scientific community was going crazy with discoveries. Humanity's natural inclination to mess with things until they worked was unlocking secrets that the Corinthians had spent millennia failing to understand. The Emperor had one last card to play. Deep in the palace's most secure vault, there was a precursor device that the Empire had spent 5,000 years studying. They called it the Reality Engine, though they didn't really understand what it did. Ancient texts suggested it could unmake matter at a fundamental level, basically deleting things from existence. It had never been tested because the calculations suggested that using it might destroy half the planet as collateral damage. Maltha's hand hovered over the activation control. His advisors were screaming at him through the communication channels. Some begged him to use it. Others begged him not to. The Emperor was facing the collapse of everything his civilization was built on. For 10,000 years, the Corinthians had maintained power through their monopoly on precursor technology. Now a species that had barely learned to leave their own solar system was demonstrating a natural ability to interface with that technology in ways the Empire never could. But as his finger moved toward the button, something made him pause. Reports were still flooding in. Human colonies weren't just activating precursor sites. They were sharing what they learned. Every discovery was being broadcast openly, every success replicated and improved upon. The humans weren't trying to hoard the knowledge or use it to dominate others. They were treating these incredible discoveries the same way they treated everything else, as interesting problems to solve together. Emperor Maltha's finger stopped millimeters from the activation button. It wasn't because he suddenly developed a conscience or had a change of heart about humanity. The Emperor was many things, but sentimental wasn't one of them. What stopped him was the voice of his chief political advisor practically screaming through the emergency channel about what was happening in the Imperial Senate. While Malthor had been focused on the Titan crisis, his political rivals had been busy. 3 of the most powerful senators had already released public statements praising the Titan activation as a new dawn for galactic civilization. They were calling for immediate cooperation with human specialists to unlock more precursor technology. 2 major noble houses had announced partnerships with Earth-based research institutions. The Emperor's own Minister of Technology had just gone on live broadcast talking about how the Empire needed to adapt to changing times. In other words, the political class had already decided which way the wind was blowing, and they were racing to get on the right side of history. If Malthor used the Reality Engine now and destroyed the Titan, he wouldn't be remembered as the Emperor who saved the galaxy from a terrible threat. He'd be remembered as the fool who destroyed the greatest opportunity the galaxy had seen in millions of years because he was too proud and too scared to adapt. Malthor pulled his hand back and slumped in his throne. He'd just lost a 10,000-year-old empire without a single shot accomplishing anything. The Corinthian civilization wouldn't end, but it would never be the same. His finger moved to a different control, and he opened a channel to the Titan site. The message was simple: cease all military action and establish communication protocols with the human. It was probably the most bitter command Malthor had ever given, but it beat the alternative of being remembered as history's biggest idiot. Jake felt the attack stop through his connection with the Titan. The neural link was starting to feel almost natural now, though he suspected that once he disconnected, he'd have the mother of all headaches. Through the Titan's sensors, he could perceive the Corinthian military pulling back and establishing a perimeter. A few minutes later, a communication drone approached broadcasting a message that basically said, "Please don't destroy us, we'd like to talk." Over the next few hours, Jake learned something important about ancient super-advanced technology. It came with really good autopilot features. The Titan could handle most operations on its own once it understood what needed doing. Jake's role was more like a supervisor than a pilot. He provided direction and intent, and the Titan figured out the details. This was incredibly fortunate because Jake had no idea how to actually rebuild a planet's infrastructure or stabilize tectonic plates. The negotiation process was awkward as hell. Here was Jake, a maintenance worker who'd started his day expecting to replace some air filters, suddenly sitting across a holographic conference table from the Emperor of the galaxy's most powerful civilization. Malthor looked like he'd aged a decade in the last few hours. His scales had lost some of their luster, and his three eyes kept darting around like he expected more disasters to appear at any moment. Jake kept things simple. He explained what the Titan had shown him about precursor intentions. The technology had been left behind for species curious and brave enough to use it, not for civilizations to lock away in museums. The Titans were tools meant to be shared, used, and understood. Fighting over them or trying to maintain monopolies would just repeat the mistakes that had led previous civilizations to stagnation. Malthor listened with the expression of someone swallowing medicine that tasted terrible but was necessary. He agreed to Jake's terms, which weren't really demands so much as obvious next steps. The Corinthian Empire would open its precursor archives to researchers from all species. They'd share data about artifacts they'd been studying for millennia. In exchange, humans would teach others how to interface with precursor systems and share whatever they learned. The word that kept getting used in those early negotiations was partnership, though everyone knew it was more complicated than that. The old power structure was crumbling. The Corinthians would remain important because they had the largest collection of precursor artifacts and millennia of observational data. But they'd no longer be the gatekeepers of ancient knowledge. What happened next moved faster than anyone expected. Jake became something that hadn't existed before, a Titan Keeper. It wasn't a title he particularly wanted, and it came with way more responsibility than he'd ever asked for, but someone had to do it. He started training other humans in how to interface with precursor systems. The neural link with the Titan had taught him things he couldn't fully explain but could somehow demonstrate to others. Within 6 months, there were 4 to 7 certified Titan Keepers, all human, all working with active Titans across the galaxy. They became the most sought-after specialists in known space. Civilizations that had ignored humanity or looked down on humans as primitive newcomers were suddenly very interested in establishing diplomatic relations with Earth. Earth itself transformed almost overnight. The planet had been a decent but unremarkable world in galactic terms. Humans were known mostly for being enthusiastic traders and surprisingly good mechanics. Now Earth became the center of a technological revolution. The best minds from hundreds of species came to human universities and research centers to study precursor technology. Human cities that had been struggling economically suddenly became thriving hubs of galactic commerce and research. The Corinthian Empire didn't collapse, but it did something arguably harder: it changed. The old guard, the nobles and senators who'd built their power on hoarding ancient secrets, found themselves increasingly irrelevant. A new generation of Corinthian leaders emerged, ones who understood that the future belonged to those who could adapt and collaborate. Some of the old emperor's rivals launched what amounted to a soft coup, forcing reforms that opened up Corinthian society in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Malthor himself stepped down after 2 years, which in Corinthian terms was basically admitting defeat. But historians would later note that he could have handled things much worse. He could have started a war that would have torn the galaxy apart. Instead, he'd swallowed his pride and managed the transition. It wasn't heroic, but it was smart, and sometimes that mattered more. Jake eventually made it back to Earth, though he spent most of his time traveling between worlds helping activate and maintain Titans. He never quite got used to the fame or the importance everyone placed on him. In his mind, he'd just been curious about a weird energy signature and had pushed some buttons to see what would happen. The fact that it changed galactic civilization was mostly accident. But maybe that was exactly the point. The precursors hadn't left their technology for the careful, the cautious, or the wise. They'd left it for the curious.